I just want to thank Yolanda and the team for inviting me to chat with you today. And I do want to say, I try to keep these kind of open format. I do have information, but if you start to think of questions or have comments as we go along, if it seems super relevant, just raise your hand and maybe somebody can help me curate that or drop questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So with that, I've interacted a little bit with some folks on this webinar, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dan Olmsted. I'm a senior extension associate with Cornell Integrated Pest Management, which is part of Cornell CALS. And my role within our program is digital outreach and development coordinator. But I'm also project lead for something called NUA, short for the Network for Environment and Weather Applications, and a nice growing suite of other projects and efforts surrounding weather, microclimate, which we'll talk about today, and all sorts of stuff in the spirit of decision support. So we're using weather data, we're using informed models that are built by researchers to provide short-term risk forecasts, more or less. So this is a really interesting crossover area that I'm going to talk about today. And this crowd is this is the debut of a brand new slide deck that I have with some really interesting information. So I'm looking forward to sharing it. So with that, I think my title kind of alludes to what we're going to talk about today. But if I see here. Okay, jump right into it. One of the things I did is try to quantify, what we're talking about today. And so I just have some stats to get started. In the peer-reviewed literature, there are studies out there, but I wanted to consolidate it to provide some context. And so if we look at summer nighttime temperatures, 7 degrees warmer than surrounding rural areas, on average 22 days more in a typical growing season. And that's got pros and cons, which we'll talk about towards the end of the discussion. In urban areas across the eastern US, 28% more rainfall, interestingly, downwind from large urban areas. And then if we focus just briefly in on New York City specifically, we've got probably over 550 community-based gardens and farms. And so when you look at this big picture, there are a lot of implications for understanding what microclimate is and how it impacts your production. And I have a comment at the bottom. Every urban farm sits inside a measurable, repeatable shift in temperature, season length, rainfall. And so the forecast that you see on the news or from an app actually, in my opinion, may not be all that useful when you're working at the scale that we are often managing in an urban production environment. I want to provide just a common definition for this talk. And so for this talk, I'm defining microclimate as the weather and air conditions in a small place. I say air conditions because I have some data that I'm going to share with you, but more generally, it can refer to soil conditions. It can refer to rainfall patterns. It can refer to moisture in the air. But for this talk, we're going to focus on air measurements. So your urban farm is inside a microclimate, and it can differ, like I said, from the forecast. It can be different from what's happening down the street. And it's certainly different from what's happening out in rural areas with our farming neighbors and collaborators. I have some examples of things that influence microclimate. So buildings and pavements, our heat sinks, they soak up all that summer heat, and it has really important effects during the overnight hours. If you really zoom in, if you've got a raised bed of green beans, for example, things that are going inside the little microcosm, the little canopy within your green beans, changes that microclimate. It changes the ability of the soil to retain moisture. It changes the temperature of the air inside that canopy. Um, Wind and structures, if we're surrounded by apartment buildings, that's going to impact airflow. And then, if you're nearby a body of water that has a mitigating effect on how fast or slow temperatures change over a period of time. So I want to talk a little bit about the urban heat island, and I'm sure everybody here has some understanding of what this is. I just want to touch briefly on why cities are warmer than what happens in rural areas or further out in the country. Because, it's not, they don't just feel hotter at night, they actually are hotter because of what I said in the previous slide. We have these structures and these materials that are absorbing heat, and it has an important impact. So outside the city during the day, plants are pulling moisture from the soil and then they release it over time into the atmosphere. And that moisture acts as a coolant to the air. If we look at what's happening inside the city, though, again, we have these heat sinks and there's not a lot of moisture. So that already is changing these different types of environments. At night, heat escapes more quickly into the atmosphere and mornings start out cooler, whereas you have a very slow release effect of that heat that we're talking about throughout the night. And in the morning, you're already starting out warmer than you would have in rural conditions. And so the overall result is our cooler nights, bigger day-night swings outside the city. And then inside the city, the literature is telling us that on average, you have 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer nights than nearby rural areas. So at the same latitude in the same season, you're getting different climates. The next thing I'm going to do is I've pulled 3 case studies from the literature that I want to kind of dive into a little bit, again, to give you some context about what we're discussing. And then after I do these case studies, I've got some real data, which I'm really excited to share as we're discussing climates in crop canopies and out in the open and so on. So the first study is from Shang et al. 2016. And the question they ask is, do cities really have longer growing seasons than rural areas around them? And if so, how much? And so what they did is they looked at NASA satellite data and they measured when in the Boston metropolitan area vegetation starts to green versus surrounding areas. And so what they found is that in the urban areas, due to localized climate effects and temperature and whatnot, there's a difference of 18 to 22 days. So you're adding 18 to 22 days to the growing season. And that the plants did, in fact, green up earlier in the season. So what does it mean? Potentially, you have a longer period of time to grow a wider variety of crops. But on the flip side, there's also more opportunity for insect pests, diseases, weeds to have an impact on your production. So it's kind of goes both ways, which I find really interesting. So the second case study I want to talk about is from Gaffin et al. 2008. And they asked the interesting question, okay, so we know that there's a documented heat island effect, but is it the same everywhere in the city? If we think about a place like New York and all 5 boroughs, I think it's an important question to ask. Well, do we just assume that everybody is going to have the same shift in growing conditions, or are there pockets that might be warmer or cooler, or perhaps do run more in parallel with rural areas? Maybe in park areas or places where there's actually more vegetation available for that mitigating effect, what is really going on. The method they used is that they took temperatures at 5 locations in Manhattan, Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn throughout 2002. So this was a while ago. And as I was reading this, I was thinking it would be interesting to look for more recent things. But this really, in my opinion, showed a good case study in terms of what we could expect. And so the finding is that this heat island strength really fluctuates across New York City. So some places did see that heat island effect, but other locations, interestingly, showed a cooling island effect. The exact reasons for that were various in their sources, but one we can't universally fit a certain a certain assumption to all locations within an urban area. So on your city block, it's not average everywhere in that block. A farm that's just maybe a couple 100 feet away could have a different experience than you, or a farm 2 miles across the city might have similar experiences to you. And this really starts to get at why understanding your microclimate is important. There's just a lot of variation, and it's really hard to be able to make trustworthy assumptions without understanding your specific situation. Okay, so case study number three looks at rainfall. This was the most interesting one to me because it makes, the other ones we talk about a lot, and at least in my circles. But when I read this one, I was really surprised. So this is Shepard Pearson Negri, 2002. Again, the question was, do cities as a functional unit alter the rainfall patterns above and around them? And if so, by how much? So again, this team used NASA satellite data to measure summer rainfall in different metropolitan areas over the course of 3 years. They compared rates at different distances downwind from each city. And what they found is that across all of these different sites they evaluated, mean monthly rainfall was 28 to 30% higher outside of these cities following the path of wherever the prevailing winds are going. Um, and so, again, if we talk about New York City, I think the synthesis was that the boroughs in New York were increasing rainfall, perhaps out on Long Island and Connecticut versus actually in the city itself. So, and just to explain a little bit of the physics there, because you have heat rising, it's taking all of that moisture, it's creating convection, and it's literally creating its own weather systems. So like pop up rainstorms or thunderstorms, whatever. So cities don't just affect heat, and they actually can reshape weather patterns and rainfall. Um, and so again, understanding the patterns in your specific location are super important. I don't have time today to touch on all of these, but I wanted to at least give them some daylight because they are interesting to consider. Um, so other things that can influence growing conditions, the heat generated by our vehicles or air conditioners, equipment, road work, all those things are something to consider in an urban environment. Light and shadow, this one's really fascinating to me. Again, if you're working in an area that is surrounded by buildings of a certain height, you can get literal shadows, you can get rain shadows, you get wind alterations, and so on and so forth. Then we have pavement runoff. So I think it's obvious that rain cannot soak through pavement. But that where that water goes and how it collects can influence a whole bunch of things. Um, if you think about it. Then we have air pollution. So all those particulates that are being generated from industry and from transportation and whatnot, like they change how clouds form. So moisture will condense on particulate matter, and they can also interfere with sunlight if those levels get high enough. And I sound like a broken record, but because we have all of these different things influencing the exact conditions that impact our ability to grow food in urban areas, we have to know how to measure our microclimates. I don't want to get deep into it today, but I mentioned I'm project lead for this NUA platform. If anybody's interested, you can go to newa.cornell.edu just to get a sense of what I'm talking about. But I bring it up because historically, and this has been a pretty successful program, but it's successful because it has been built around high return on investment crops, so apples and grapes. And it is very effective, but it's also very labor intensive, and you also need to have the resources to purchase equipment. But I bring this up because the traditional model for doing risk assessments, whether it's for insect pests or plant diseases or crop management, is all right, I'm going to buy a weather station and I'm going to put it in a central location out in the open so I can get good rainfall measurements and wind and so on and so forth. But what weather stations really do, unless you have a really high density of them, is they describe, uh, I phrase it as they describe regions. But where you're planting your crop, or planting your garden is something so much smaller, and so this is really a scale problem. In this slide, I put together four different scales to help make those connections as we're talking about this disconnect and weather station measurements or what you're seeing in your 5-day forecast. So at a really broad scale, if we zoom out, if we're looking at Google Maps or something, we have this regional forecasts that maybe information is coming from National Weather Service or NOAA, and things are being synthesized. Well, I think what isn't as apparent is, and I only know this because I've been working with these sorts of data for so long, is that it's actually not point data. So you might have maybe 3 or 4 weather stations that are reasonably accurate in, say, a 20-mile area. And so you're actually looking at like the average of all those values in between. And so the predictive resolution of these forecasts that you're seeing, whether it's AccuWeather or your local news channel or whatever, it's probably not any higher than 4 or 5 square kilometers. So that's like about three by 3 miles. And a lot can vary within that if you think about it. So whether you're in a near city borough or you're out in a rural area, there's a lot happening where you just don't have that resolution. So that's the first scale. Um, the second scale, if we zoom in a little bit, and this goes back to the idea of NUA, is that, all right, if I'm a farmer out in a rural area, I've purchased a weather station, or my neighbor has a weather station, maybe 5 miles down the road, or there's one at an airport. I'm just going to use that to estimate my conditions. But then if we keep zooming in, and this is where it becomes more relevant, we have like a city block. And beyond that, we have maybe a 1/4 acre garden plot, just as an example, where you're planting a specific vegetable in a raised bed in the back northwest corner that's sometimes sunny and sometimes shady, and it always seems to be wet. So again, I'm just I'm providing these scales to provide some sense of what we're trying to get at here. Um, and the only other thing I'll say is that without these on-farm measurements, even within an urban farming setting, like this, the gap in your data is not visible. It's unseen, and you don't truly know like what is reliable versus maybe a more generalized forecast and what really needs to be tailored to your situations. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about data. So I'm located in Geneva, New York, up at Cornell Agritech, and I have a bunch of research stations where um, the base I have a base station. It follows like that traditional pattern I was talking about, where it's out in the middle of a completely open and maintained field. But what I've done the last 3 or 4 years is I've tapped into this system where you can connect wireless temperature sensors that capture exactly the same thing. And then it's all collated in the cloud and is available to me for like data set compilation and stuff like that. So the next 3 or 4 slides, what I want to do is give you an exact visual of exactly how different things can be within a couple hundred feet of each other. So to give you some context in my methods, um, there are 3 sensors that I used for these visualizations. The sensors each capture temperature and relative humidity. And then from those measurements, we can also calculate dew point. And I'll get into that in a few slides. I'll explain exactly what that is if you're not 100% clear. And then we can also estimate other things like vapor pressure deficit. And that's where it gets really interesting. So, um, to get right into it, I have 2 graphs here. And to give you an orientation, the red line is coming from that open air base station. So temperature, relative humidity, so on and so forth. The green line is coming from inside an apple tree canopy. And in this case, there are actually different ways you can manage apple orchards. This is considered a high density managed apple orchard. So it almost looks like very tall, dense fence rows versus the traditional tall and bushy apple tree that you might see when you go to do pick your own apples. The third one is inside a grapevine canopy in a research vineyard, um, not far. That's probably a quarter mile from the base station. So the first thing I did is I averaged the daily temperature for each one of these sensors. On the left-hand side, you see temperature, and on the right-hand side, you see relative humidity. So when I do this, temperature is not really too exciting to look at on a daily basis. You can see that the lines mostly overlap, and there's not really anything exciting to talk about. But when we look at relative humidity, and I'm always like, it's very addictive to see this in real time during the summer, because that's the other thing our systems can do is we can watch the data come in. But what happens with relative humidity is even when we summarize to a daily level, there's an immediate differentiation in what's going on in the microclimates around each one of those sensors. So you can see that the open air station reports the lowest relative humidity consistently. There is no overlap with the relative humidity reported either in apples or in grapes. And so again, try to visualize like the way in which an apple tree grows. So like almost as soon as you get into where the leaves are growing and the fruits are developing, there's like this boundary layer. And then inside the apple tree, something very different is happening with relative humidity, which is the amount of moisture that the air is holding. So think about on a hot, humid summer day, it's almost like there's so much moisture in the air, it's very uncomfortable. So outside to inside, there's definitely a gradient. And then even more interesting, grapes grow in even a different way. And so when we look at the microclimate inside the grape canopy, it's almost at 100%, and there's going to be implications for that. So, before we move on from this slide, temperature, it has a very close correlation between these different microclimates, but humidity lines can have a spread of more than 20 percentage points every single day. So keep that in mind. So next, we're going to break this down hour by hour. So this is over a 21-day period, actually just within the last month here. Um, so you're looking at hourly values throughout the 24-hour period for the past 21 days. And visually, you can already see that there are things coming out that we don't see in the daily data. Um, this really gets at the importance of understanding your growing system and understanding that not only do we have at any given point in time the possibility of differences in these microclimate conditions, but we now have a temporal aspect. So you can see that from midnight to 6 a.m., temperature is pretty consistently in the same range. But then as the sun rises and we move through the day, you see this very predictable curve. And then at the end of the day, it goes back down. Around noon, we see an average of 3.4 degrees Fahrenheit spread over those 21 days. And at night, we see a difference of around 1.9 Fahrenheit. And again, before I move on from this slide, just look at the base station compared to the apple and grape canopies, and you start to see a little bit of what could be happening in different fruit and vegetable microclimates. Now I want to talk about humidity, and this is where it starts to get really interesting. And so on this slide and the next slide, like this is where you want to pay really close attention because what I see from the data sets that I look at, so temperature, there could be some interesting things happening, but I think humidity is by far going to have the greatest implication for crop management in urban farming and urban gardening settings because humidity has such a direct connection to disease pressures. Um, so again, if we look at the base station, it's the same trend. It's out in the open, the air is flowing, so humidity is consistently lower over the typical 24-hour period. But then look at the apple trend, and then very importantly, look at the grape trend. So grapes have like a very dense leaf canopy, probably with a lot less airflow. And you can see that a majority of the day, the humidity is greater than 95%. And so the general rule of thumb is that when relative humidity exceeds 95%, you can assume that there's leaf wetness because that water is going to condense on the leaves. So the canopies are always more humid than in the open air. And then this creates opportunities for fungal disease pressure and other things that are going on. Now, that's humidity. So now we talk about dew point, and this ties in directly with temperature and relative humidity because we calculate dew point from those two things. And so I want to try and explain what's going on here. So the base station, the dew point is the temperature at which water condenses out of the air. So around noon, from the open air reference point, the temperature at which dew will condense out of the air during this time period is around, I would say, like 42 or 43 degrees. If we go back and we look just before sunrise, just before 6 a.m., the dew point for grape and for apple they're higher, but they're still pretty close to what that baseline is from the open air reference. But look at what happens during the day. If you think about the fact that relative humidity goes up, by the time we get to noon and we look at grapes, the dew point has risen to 52 or 53 degrees compared to that 42 or 43 degrees. So that's like a 12 degree Fahrenheit spread. So that means um, you can have condensation at a higher temperature because of those conditions. And so when you get that condensation, again, that's when you're at an increased risk for disease susceptibility. So I'll just kind of let that sink in again. Um, so there's that point to make about relative humidity. If we look at that in the context of management, and we look at our different crops, there's a lot that we have to consider here. So if I was just looking at the temperature that's reported in my app on May 5th, maybe around 6 a.m., and we're looking at relative humidity, there's no disease risk if I'm looking at the data, and that's a valid interpretation. But what we're not considering is that we're not looking at the microclimate conditions, because if we were, and I was growing something like strawberries in an urban garden or an urban farm, I would actually be at a very high risk for disease when I'm under the assumption that I'm at a very low risk. So just to summarize a little bit, I spent some time looking for data specifically on some of the crops I know are of importance in urban settings, but I kind of took a different approach with this. So if I took the data that I have for apple canopies and grape canopies, and we can use these as a proxy for other crops. If and I also generalized some of the criteria for disease pressure from known literature just to come up with this table for you. So if we're looking at apple scab and we were to compare these different things across our known data set, the base station would say, you have a very low risk of apple scab. If I use the data coming from the designated apple canopy, we're still below threshold. But say I had a different variety of apple in a different area and I wasn't measuring it. And what if that humidity was very high? We'd actually be at a high risk and wouldn't realize it because we'd only be looking at the base station. Um, so this is how that's set up. The one I do want to point out is botrytis, because I know a lot of people grow strawberries, especially down in NYC in the boroughs. But if we apply the same concept, if we were to look at a base station and, just kind of for a moment say, oh, okay, this is what my AccuWeather app is telling me the temperature is, or the relative humidity, it would say there's no risk. But in actuality, strawberries are growing low to the ground. They might be on straw mulch. The humidity could be really high, which in turn increases the dew point. I could actually be experiencing really high pressure and not know it. So there's a lot of variation going on here. All right. And then, so what I want to do here is just talk about some trade-offs in context to everything else I'm sharing. So we know from the data I've shared that there are significant differences in what is happening in terms of temperature and relative humidity outside versus inside crop canopies. But what we can do is also look at this in the context of irrigation and watering. So, just a really quick definition recap. I'm going to talk about vapor pressure deficit. And that is basically how thirsty the air is for water. So hot, dry air is going to pull water out of leaves faster than cold air. And so if you have high VPD, it means the plant's working really hard to stay hydrated. But what I want to point out is that so the same conditions that build disease pressure actually also buffer, your crops from water stress for the exact same reason. And that's where things start to get really tricky. And this is where experience and management come into play. Whether it's working with CC Harvest New York or another group, collectively growing your understanding of what these trade-offs are in a microclimate are going to be good in the long run. So again, and I think this is my last graph, really what this shows, it takes all that data I just had in those other graphs and it puts it in context of vapor pressure deficit. So if we look at this, that open air station is going to be experiencing 10 hours of water stress versus that grape canopy, which we were so concerned about in the last slides, is actually sitting pretty well and does not need irrigation, except for that one little point where it exceeds the threshold in the middle of May 4th. So where you measure these things is going to determine what risk you see. And I think the goal, whether you're, somebody growing food out in a rural area or working in an urban environment for food production or for other purposes, is to try and get the most accurate view of what your risk really is. I think I've got 3 or 4 more slides here. And what I want to do is really try and wrap this all up. But if we go back for a second to what I mentioned earlier in the slide deck, the growing season in the typical urban area, if we look at the literature, is really expanded. So, and this is just an estimate. This is a visualization I came up with, but more or less, you get 2 more weeks in the spring, and you get about 3 weeks later, depending on where you are in the fall, due to that urban heat island effect. So there's pros and cons to both of that. So what it enables is that you can plant earlier and you can harvest later, which is great. You could even consider things like peppers and eggplants being planted a little bit earlier. But there are risks as well. And what we actually are experiencing the past 3 or 4 years in rural areas is that our apple and stone fruit trees, the trends have really been warming up, and I think we've all experienced this, but then they crash. And unfortunately, what happens is it tricks our trees into thinking it's time to bloom and pollinate and all that stuff. And so the blossoms come out first. But if those blossoms come out and then we get a freeze event, the blossoms fall off and you run a significant risk of losing your entire crop. I think, and so this has happened the past 3 or 4 years, like I mentioned, and most recently, just 2 weeks ago, there was a statewide freeze event, and I think a lot of fruit and stone fruit production in the lower Hudson got hammered. Like some people lost 80 to 90% of their crops. So if you plant earlier and you happen to have a frost, and depending on where you are, you do run the risk of having that sort of damage. So what does this all mean? A longer season is an opportunity and a risk. Your location does not necessarily match the regional average or even what's going on citywide. And really, you've got to rely on sensors and data over time, not just like through one season, but over a couple of seasons to start to understand like what that fingerprint is for the microclimates that are produced from the crops that you're going to be planting. And so it brings me to my last slide. And I want to talk the most about this one before I stop. I mentioned we have the NUA platform and it works great for who the target audience is. But one of the things that we have been working on at Cornell IPM for 2 years now, both on just like how we can do it technically and also trying to find relationship building opportunities, is a platform that is called Everyone Grows. And I'm just going to kind of talk about this generally, but it's a platform because we've identified the fact that a lot of resources have been devoted to rural agricultural production, but that similar workflows or similar platforms might be useful if we're talking about risk assessment with disease, with insects, with crop production in urban environments. So what we have done, and this has been an effort I've been working on behind the scenes, mostly on the back end, like in terms of an infrastructure, not in terms of content, is building a system that is accessible, both technologically and financially. One weather station for the Newell platform can cost $3,500, and that does not include a data plan. That is untenable for a lot of folks. Like, unless you have a minimum acreage and you're generating a lot of income from a high value crop like apples or grapes, this is a stretch. And then even for smaller first generation farmers, this is out of reach. So what we're doing is we're building this platform. Everyone grows. It's going to be a bilingual platform. There's a toggle that you move back and forth, and it instantly changes the entire thing from English to Spanish. Um, it's going to be community based. So this is not Cornell IPM going out and saying, we have this great product. This is us going out and saying, what do folks need? We can provide technical support. We can provide requirements gathering, like what basic tools do folks need to help advance urban agriculture? Maybe it's a strawberry disease tool, maybe it's measuring soil moisture, maybe it's something else. But we're not going to be like pushing models that we have built because we think they're the best thing out there. It's really going to be flipped on its head. The third part of this is that it has to be affordable and accessible. So there's two things that I'm building to provide the type of data that I've been talking about the past 30 minutes or so. One is that we're going to be using much smaller loggers. They might take only like one or two parameters, like temperature, relative humidity, but they're also only $100 or $200. So that's the first step. The second step, and this is really important, is that the past 2 years we have purchased Cornell IPM. We've actually bulk purchased a bunch of these loggers with the intent of distributing them to potential partners. So folks in CCE Harvest New York have had an opportunity to kind of play around with these, see what they're about. But moving forward, we're going to try and purchase like a cohort of them like each growing season. I don't know what the number will be, but then the idea is, we'll connect with Harvest New York folks. We'll connect with other community groups. Does not have to be Cornell, but basically a group or a person who can provide the expertise, like in urban agriculture, to understand and be able to communicate with the stakeholders about like what is the benefit of these, and then also relay back like what are the needs, because like I said, we're ready to assist. We're not here to like be pushing any finished product that a lot of people are not going to adopt. So this is in partnership with Cornell IPM, New York State Ag and Markets, and like I said, Harvest New York. And the goal really is we want microclimate measurements to be accessible to every grower, not just people who have the operating or research budget. And hopefully at some point in the future, this Everyone Grows platform is going to become a centralized point of being able to quickly make those sorts of management decisions. So that's my slide deck. I'm not sure where I am on time, but like we can definitely have a discussion. I can answer questions, anything that people like. I'm happy to talk at this point. So thank you very much.
Can you put that link on that new website, in the chat box? Oh,
So this website is still
oh,
in
still in
develop.
the
There's
works.
yeah,
Okay,
and this it's a good point to bring up because I almost don't want to put this out until we have buy-in.
got it.
Otherwise, it just, in my opinion, it creates the wrong type of vibe. Because I don't want us to be publicly like out in front saying, "Hey, Cornell IPM is doing this or that." It's really got to be community based.
Okay,
Um,
got it.
but I can I can share it when we've got like just a basic site up, and then maybe you can distribute that.
hmm So any questions, comments?
Thank you, Dan. That was super
Yeah,
informative, targeted to
Appreciate
New
it.
York City.
yeah, lots of great case studies and real life data, so that's great.
Curious,
Has
Dan, like
anybody?
what your thoughts are on as these regions, I'm based out in Long Island, even think about adding these data centers. And one of the big issues with the data centers is all of the waste heat
Yeah.
that it's exhausting into the climates and what types of additions you think that might have.
Yeah, I think, and so there's the Salt Lake City issue going on right now, and that's going to be, I think they're actually comparing it, it's like twice the size of Manhattan or something. And so it's going to have the same sort of impact. Like it's going to create, like depending on how big the data center is, I feel like, it's certainly possible. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, no, it's just fascinating to be thinking about like these microclimates and like the impacts downwind. Like I said, even being in Long Island wasn't like thinking about the impacts of New York uh, having on the climate downwind. Hmm.
Yeah. I did, Yolanda, I sent you a PDF of my slides, so
Yep,
feel free to share that with whoever you want.
great. All right, I'm gonna stop recording.